Imagine waking up to a world so frozen, so silent, that even the wind seems afraid to make a sound. The snow has fallen all night, blanketing everything in white, and somewhere in that frozen wilderness, 3 small girls are huddled in an abandoned barn with nothing but a horse to keep them warm. They have no food, no hope, and no reason to believe anyone is coming. But then, through the morning mist, a lone cowboy appears on the ridge. He sees tracks in the snow leading to that barn, and in that moment, he faces a choice that will change everything. Does he ride past, pretending he saw nothing, or does he step into a nightmare that was never his to solve? This is the story of Jonah, a man who had already lost everything he owned. His ranch was gone, sold off to pay debts he couldn't escape. His pride had been stripped away by years of hard work that led nowhere. He was just another forgotten soul riding through a frozen valley with no particular place to go. But sometimes, the universe puts you exactly where you need to be, even when you don't know it yet. That morning, as he rounded a bend near an old, half-collapsed barn, he noticed something that made him pause. Footprints, small and desperate, led straight to the barn-shadowed entrance. They weren't the tracks of an adult. They were the footprints of children, and they told a story of frantic movement, of desperation cutting through the snow. Jonah could have kept riding. He could have told himself it wasn't his problem, that he had enough troubles of his own. But something in those tracks spoke to him in a language older than words. It was the language of survival, of fear, of lives hanging by a thread. So he dismounted, his boots sinking deep into the snow, and walked toward the barn with his heart pounding in his chest. What he found inside would haunt him forever, but it would also remind him of something he had almost forgotten. That sometimes, the smallest act of courage can mean the difference between life and death. Inside the barn, the air was so cold it burned to breathe. Pale light filtered through cracks in the weathered boards, and dust motes floated in the frozen stillness like tiny stars suspended in time. And there, huddled together in the shadows, were 3 little girls. Their faces were pale from cold and hunger, their clothes torn and threadbare, and snow clung to their hair like frost. Between them stood a horse, its coat matted and its eyes wide with the same fear and exhaustion that showed on the girls' faces. The youngest girl peeked out from behind her sister's arm, her eyes measuring whether this stranger was a friend or just another threat. Jonah's throat tightened as he took in the scene, because he understood immediately what had happened here. These children had been abandoned. He knelt slowly, careful not to startle them, and let his eyes meet theirs. He didn't speak right away because words can be empty when you're dealing with people who have been let down too many times. Instead, he reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a rough wool blanket, wrapping it gently around the youngest girl. She flinched at first, but then relaxed as the warmth began to seep into her frozen skin. The other girls watched him carefully, their eyes sharp and guarded, because survival had taught them to trust no one. But Jonah understood that. He had learned the same lessons in his own life, just in different ways. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and steady. He told them his name was Jonah, and he introduced them to his horse, Casey. He asked if they were hurt, and the oldest girl, who looked far too old for her age, told him they were okay. But Jonah could see the truth in their hollow cheeks and trembling hands. They were not okay. They were surviving, but barely, and time was running out. He asked them where their parents were, and the answer came back simple and devastating. They were gone. They had been gone for a long time. No one came to check on them. No one cared enough to notice 3 children slowly freezing to death in an abandoned barn. Jonah felt anger rise in his chest, but he pushed it down because anger wouldn't help these girls. What they needed was action, not emotion. So he began to move with quiet purpose. He scattered dried corn for Casey, who ate gratefully while keeping a careful eye on the children. He checked their fingers and toes for frostbite, adjusting blankets and making sure they were as warm as possible. He spoke to them in low, measured tones, telling them that they would get through this, one step at a time. He didn't make grand promises because he knew better than that. Life doesn't respect promises. But he could offer them something far more valuable: his presence, his commitment, the certainty that they were no longer alone. As the storm outside began to thicken, Jonah explored the barn more carefully. He found scraps of rotted food crawling with insects, evidence that the girls had been eating whatever they could scavenge. He found letters and notes, yellowed and water-stained, filled with empty apologies and broken promises from parents who had failed them in every way that mattered. The handwriting trembled across the pages, but the words revealed negligence dressed up as misfortune. Jonah set the papers aside, his jaw tight, because he knew what needed to happen next. He needed to confront the people who had let this happen, and he needed to make sure it never happened again. By late afternoon, Jonah had made his decision. He led the girls and Casey through the snow toward the Miller homestead, a sagging, weather-beaten house that looked as neglected as the barn. Smoke rose thin and gray from a crooked chimney, and when Jonah knocked on the warped door, a gaunt man answered with suspicion in his eyes. Jonah didn't waste time with pleasantries. He told the man they needed to talk, and he laid out the evidence he had found in the barn. The letters, the rotted food, the footprints in the snow. Every piece of it pointed to one undeniable truth. These children had been abandoned, and the law had failed to notice. The man tried to make excuses, his voice quavering as he claimed the girls would be fine, that it wasn't as bad as it looked. But Jonah didn't let him hide behind weak justifications. He spoke with quiet authority, his words deliberate and unyielding. He told the man that the time for excuses had passed, that the girls had survived hunger and cold and neglect, but they deserved more than survival. They deserved safety, and the world's indifference would no longer define their fate. The man slumped into a chair, exhaustion and fear overtaking whatever pride he had left, and Jonah knew the confrontation was over. He had won, not through violence or threats, but through the undeniable weight of moral truth. Jonah loaded the girls and Casey into a sleigh he had prepared, blankets bundled and provisions packed for the journey ahead. As they slid smoothly over the crusted snow, he glanced back at the homestead one last time. The man remained seated inside, staring blankly through the falling snow, a silent witness to the accountability that had arrived without violence, but with undeniable force. Jonah understood that this moment would resonate far beyond the valley. It was a reckoning of moral power versus indifference, of quiet courage overcoming systemic cruelty. By the time night fell, Jonah had the girls safely inside a small cabin he had prepared. Warmth radiated from the hearth, and Casey was tethered nearby, his muscles relaxed and his eyes soft. The girls began to unbundle themselves, their movements tentative at first, then growing more confident as they realized they were truly safe. Jonah moved among them, offering food and adjusting blankets, his voice steady and reassuring. He knelt beside the youngest girl and brushed a hand across her hair, telling her simply that she was safe now, and no one could take that from her. Her small fingers closed over his hand, and in that moment, trust was conveyed without words. Outside, the wind stilled, leaving only the soft whisper of falling snow. Jonah stood at the cabin doorway, looking toward the distant horizon where pale gold light shimmered across the valley floor. He felt the weight of the day lift slightly from his shoulders, replaced by a quiet sense of completion. The girls' laughter, soft and uncertain but present, rose from inside the cabin, mingling with Casey's gentle nicker. Jonah allowed himself a rare smile, a private acknowledgment of the day's truth. Kindness, persistence, and moral clarity had prevailed, at least for now. He whispered softly to himself, and perhaps to the valley itself, that those who refuse to abandon hope will always find a way. Outside, the snow continued to fall, indifferent and relentless. But inside the cabin, there was warmth, safety, and the quiet certainty of justice enacted. The story had found its balance, its truth, and its fragile hope. And Jonah understood, with the clarity that comes from walking too many cold miles alone, that sometimes the smallest act of courage can ripple across lives in ways the world might never acknowledge. But it doesn't matter if the world notices. What matters is that you act when action is needed, that you refuse to turn away when every instinct tells you to keep riding. Because in the end, that's what makes us human.